Everyone, welcome to Broadband Deployment News. Former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has an opinion piece out where he talks about the death of the internet since the repeal of net neutrality regulations on his watch. Be right back and we'll talk about that. Thanks for joining me. Rick Husey here with Broadband Deployment News. So this is obviously tongue-in-cheek and I guess a little sarcasm on his part, but I thought I'd look at this article here. So this is in the National Review. The death of the internet 5 years later. Once again, my highlighting was up here on my article and then disappeared. So I'm just going to have to read through this. I've read through it, so hopefully I won't read every word, but very interesting, his commentary, and it really kind of tracks along with my thinking on this. I've been writing about this and talking about this for years, net neutrality, since prior to the first regulations weren't put in place, when they were put in place, after they were repealed. So he has some history here, and he's commenting basically on the fact that people were talking about how the internet would be dead once these net neutrality rules were repealed. And here it's 5 years later, and basically what he's saying is the death of the internet has been greatly exaggerated. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So it says here, the primary reason net neutrality is receded as an issue is that the FCC's decision to repeal it was the right one. Do you remember where you were 5 years ago today on June 11, 2018? I'd be surprised if you don't, for that was the day the internet died, or the internet ended. The day the FCC repealed the so-called net neutrality regulations went into effect. The repeal of the regulations went into effect. And, people use the term net neutrality as if it's something that didn't exist, and then we passed the law, and then it did exist, and then we repealed the law, and it didn't exist anymore. Net neutrality is simply a net neutral internet. It existed before the regulations, it existed during the regulations, and it exists today. So when you repeal the regulations, you didn't take away net neutrality. You just repealed a lot of ungainly regulations that were based on the old telecom law that weren't really needed, and it was much better for business. So that's what he's saying here. Why was this a big deal? What led apparent journalists to prepare lists like the 6 terrible ways your life will change when net neutrality dies? What led apparent celebrities like Alyssa Milano and Mark Ruffalo to issue fervid tweet storms saying that appeal of net neutrality was one of the biggest issues threatening our democracy and an authoritarian dream? What led public officials to claim that this decision put lives at risk? And these really were, this really was hyperbole. In fact, the other day, I'll show this in a minute. The other day I was talking about, I'll show it right now. I was talking about the fact that we have a new FCC commissioner, who has been put forward for nomination on the FCC. We've been down one commissioner since Biden took over. Gigi Sohn was eventually pulled her nomination back because that wasn't going anywhere. So, I said at the time that I was reading through the article on, I think it was CNBC. Let me see here. So I was reading through this article, CNBC. And there was a statement from somebody in the Free Press, and I think that Chairman Pai mentions that publication in a minute here as I read through that. But you see here, this was some of the hyperbole. And I said at the time, I said, this is hyperbole, so I'm not going to really, I don't give this statement any credence at all. But this was from Free Press CEO Jessica Gonzalez. She said, this senseless delay is harming millions of people, including working families trying to pay their rising monthly bills, and Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and rural communities that the biggest telecom companies and broadcast conglomerates have long neglected. So that's what she was saying about this delay in having a fifth commissioner on the board, on the commission. So obviously, again, that was hyperbole, and I pointed that out, and he's saying the same thing here. Unfortunately, they want me to subscribe here, so this is this site has a lot of also annoying ads, so sorry about that. So some backgrounds in order. Many say that net neutrality is about whether internet providers can limit the transmission or access to online content, but in practice, it actually involves a rather arcane question. How should the FCC classify broadband internet access service? Should it be heavily regulated telecom service under the Communications Act, like the monopoly Ma Bell telephone service a century ago? or should it be lightly regulated information service free from preemptive micromanagement by the FCC? And by preemptive, he means putting regulations in before you have an issue. And that's been something that I've talked about for years, is why put onerous regulations on businesses when you don't have a problem yet? You might have had a few little incidents, and I'll mention some of those here probably, but there has been nothing that hasn't been addressed without regulations. Even the few minor incidents were addressed and taken care of with the current laws that we have in place and the current regulatory bodies that we have in place. At the dawn of the commercial internet, during the Clinton administration, William Kennard, one of my predecessors as FCC chairman, decided to lightly regulate this new technology. So this is the Democrat administration. He wanted to encourage the massive private investments needed to build these networks, so he embraced a market-based approach. As he said in 1999, the FCC has taken a hands-off, deregulatory approach to the broadband market. If we've learned anything about the internet and government over the last 15 years, it's that it's thrived quite nicely without the intervention of government. In fact, the best decision government ever made with respect to the internet was the decision that the FCC made, not to impose regulation on it. So that was, again, a Clinton appointee, the FCC. His successor, Michael Powell, who was under the Bush administration, extended that, and that was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court, and the framework remained during the first 6 years of the Obama administration. He talks about the fact that we benefited since then, $2 trillion in network investment. Actually, it was prior to that. Entrepreneurs developed new broadband applications and services that made our lives better. This was all prior to the Obama administration rules. And he said then something happened. Shortly after the 2014 midterm elections, President Obama published a YouTube video urging the FCC, an independent agency, to regulate the internet like a slow-moving utility. There's nothing wrong with the administration. The FCC is going to have more of the party that's in office. They're going to have more commissioners than the party that's not, unless you had a deadlocked FCC like we've had since Biden's been in place, because he hasn't replaced the fifth commissioner. But in this case, it's normally the FCC would do what the administration wants. So when it says an independent agency, I don't see this like the Justice Department, where the executive branch, even though it's an executive branch agency, it should not be getting, it's supposed to be completely independent because it's about justice. Whereas here, the FCC, I don't think there tends to be the thought that this needs to be completely independent. You've got basically a partisan kind of slant on that always, right? So that's expected. The FCC chairman at the time, who had previously proposed to maintain broadband's information service classification, promptly caved, embracing a heavy-handed regulatory approach and delighting the White House and partisan activists. Well, again, I wouldn't say he caved. I mean, he's on a partisan body that is under the direction of the executive branch. So it's not like the Justice Department, where maybe the Attorney General caves and then goes after somebody and does something that he shouldn't be doing that's going to be seen as partisan or biased. The justice is supposed to be blind. This is different. He says, I dissented from this decision at the time, so I guess he was on the FCC at that point. I pointed out that the internet was just fine, rendering regulation pointless, and he was right at the time. As I put it then, the rules were a solution that won't work to a problem that doesn't exist. And I worried that they would reduce the incentive to invest in next-generation networks, slowing broadband deployment and prolonging the digital divide. That worry was well-founded. Following the FCC's decision, and for the first time outside a recession, independent studies showed that investment in broadband infrastructure declined. I don't know if that was really a true relationship or not from that. But apparently he says that's what happened. And, one thing that did happen kind of during this period, which may have prompted the Obama administration to put these rules in place, is there were a couple of things around this time frame, if I recall. One had to do, if I remember, it was Comcast, I think, was blocking BitTorrent traffic or throttling BitTorrent traffic. BitTorrent was and still is, a file sharing service. And there were other file sharing services. Napster was one, and there were some others. And these services, basically at the time, they were strictly file sharing, and generally they were used by people that were putting up pirated software and entertainment like movies and music that they weren't supposed to put up there that was copyrighted. So pirated software, copyrighted stuff that really was illegal for them to do this, to put this. And this was causing quite a bit of strain on internet service providers' networks, because at that time, everything was downstream. They really had very little upstream. This was before fiber, and so it was DSL, cable, and it was very little upstream. Bandwidth was available. And so it wasn't so much on the downstream where it was an issue, because that's something that, you might have an individual that might be downloading a file here and there. And yeah, it was additional bandwidth. But the problem was on the upstream, because when you had an account like that, whether it was, Napster or BitTorrent, in addition to downloading stuff, you could put stuff on your own computer, like a pirated movie or a pirated piece of software. And then everybody who was on one of those services would see that was available and they could come get it. So you were acting like a server, and people would be downloading that stuff, which was uploading it from your computer, which was using upload bandwidth or upstream bandwidth from your internet service provider. So this was causing a serious problem for internet service providers. The download and the upload was really what was being noticed by internet service providers. The rest of what they were having to deal with, kind of the bandwidth floor they needed, was downloading web pages, some file downloads and other ways here and there. There wasn't much video streaming going on. So it really was this peer-to-peer, what's called peer-to-peer kinds of programs like BitTorrent and like at that time Napster and others, that was causing a lot of the bandwidth issues for ISPs. So they put equipment in place that could do throttling, deep packet inspection kind of equipment that could see, this is peer-to-peer traffic, and we're not going to let that through, or we're going to throttle it when it hits a certain point, those kinds of things. And I think Comcast was doing that. And unfortunately for them, BitTorrent was used at the time for mostly that, but it was also used, as time went on, it was used for legitimate purposes, including as a platform for software operators who wanted to, let's say, do a valid release of their software, especially, I think, gaming software, that wanted to do a valid release of their applications. They would do that on BitTorrent, and then people would come to their servers and get that through BitTorrent, and was blocking that. So that was something that Comcast shouldn't have been doing, and they, again, if it was Comcast, I'm sorry if I'm naming them, it wasn't. I think they were involved in one of these things. There was another thing, and I can't remember who this was. It was a company, it was a cable company or somebody that was blocking, I think it was video traffic that was not their own. So in other words, they were providing video service, and if there was somebody that wanted to get video from some other place, they were acting badly and blocking that. And that was brought to the attention of the FCC, as well as, I think, this BitTorrent stuff. And in both cases, basically it stopped because, like I say, there were rules in place, anti-competitive rules and other, you had regulations from the FCC and the FTC that said this is unacceptable. So that was stopped. It did not require any new regulations. The other thing that was happening about this time frame was the idea of paid prioritization, because you had there were internet service providers that were wanting to get payments from companies like, let's say, Netflix or others, and these companies were willing to do this. I think Netflix and others, may have been willing. I keep saying I think because I don't want to say, I'm not certain that I recall everything right. But some of these applications or these content providers were willing to do this paid prioritization to say, okay, we will have priority on your network so people can get to our content easier and quicker. But of course, that would lock out other content providers who couldn't afford for that paid prioritization. So that does smell like it's not net neutral. So that was also taken care of without any net neutrality regulations. Most of it just through threats of, if you don't stop doing this, we're going to put a regulation in place to force this to stop. And in a lot of cases, there were rules already in place. If it looked like it was anti-competitive, that would take care of that. So, but that may have been the impetus for some of these things. But again, everything was operating really well. You could always get wherever you wanted to go on the internet. That wasn't an issue. And then the Obama administration put the rules in place anyway. So again, he says the worry was well-founded. Oh yeah, I mentioned that there was a decline in infrastructure investment at that time. In January 2017, times changed with the new Trump administration. He was named the chairman of the FCC. He says, December we voted to repeal those regulations, and that took effect 5 years ago today is when he wrote this, just a day or two ago. It says, going on only on press coverage, social media, and the political rhetoric, you would have been justified in preparing for civilization's demise. He quotes some people. Senator Bernie Sanders proclaimed, as did news outlet CNN, that this was the end of the internet as we know it. Not to be outdone, a columnist in the New York Times moaned that the freewheeling internet has been dying a slow death, and that repealing net neutrality rules would be the final pillow in its face. The Senate Democratic Caucus's Twitter account proclaimed, if we don't save net neutrality, you'll get the internet one word at a time. Famed telecommunications regulatory experts like anonymous street artist Banksy and Silicon Valley rep Ro Khanna predicted that the internet applications would become pay-per-view, with consumers having to pay $1.99 per Google search or to purchase them in packages. And for good measure, multiple U.S. senators called the decision un-American. On top of this, there was no end to the hyperbole about how every conceivable group would suffer. And this is in the vein of what I was showing earlier from the Free Press, which he mentions here. So GLAAD claimed without net neutrality, censorship, and erasure of the LGBTQ community is not only possible, but inevitable. The Black Women's Health Imperative and the National Hispanic Media Coalition warned that for low-income Americans and people of color who have been historically underserved by the healthcare system, ending net neutrality could dramatically reduce access to life-saving health services. And what's interesting about this is net neutrality has nothing to do with that. And it's actually, again, if you put regulations in place that are going to make it harder for internet service providers to make a profit, and their costs are going to go up, and then suddenly it's going to be harder for them to provide internet in certain areas, you're actually making it worse by putting regulations in place as far as these kinds of groups. The highly partisan special interest group Free Press, that's the one I was just showing the recent quote from, argued that without net neutrality, ISPs could block speech and prevent dissident voices from speaking freely online. Without net neutrality, people of color would lose a vital platform. Again, net neutrality, nothing to do with that. The U.S. conference, unless you think internet service providers would purposely block people of color from getting to the internet or getting to certain content, and there's no reason to think they would. I'll explain why in a minute. Let's see. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops claimed that we might be forced to pay fees to ensure that our high bandwidth content receives fair treatment on the internet. Why? Even the National Association of Realtors jumped in, warning that without net neutrality regulations, real estate agents would face barriers in sharing property listing information online. He says here, amusingly, the Supreme Court earlier this year rejected the association's petition to review a federal appeals court decision that it may have violated antitrust by impeding rival real estate services from developing their own online listing databases. Some organizations twisted themselves into pretzels, declaring that even good things come to consumers were bad. For instance, the ACLU, perhaps too eager to join the motley bandwagon, argued that one example of how ISPs are violating our rights right now was that Verizon Fios was giving free Netflix for a year to new broadband customers, and AT&T also started giving out free HBO to new customers. So, he says, in sum, the critics were confident and clear. A digital apocalypse was upon us. Half a decade later, we can now make a sober assessment of their predictions. Were they right? In an era defined by the paranoid style of American political argument, it may not surprise you to learn that they were not. In fact, they were dramatically wrong. The evidence is indisputable today that in the 5 years since the FCC's decision to repeal net neutrality regulations went into effect, American consumers are benefiting from broadband networks that are stronger and more extensive than ever. And again, any impact that this has is just due to the fact that there aren't onerous regulations that would be causing higher costs on internet service providers. So they've been able to put more of their money toward developing a broadband. And here's what I want to say about that and why internet service providers would not block certain groups or anyone really from getting to legal content. Obviously, if there's something out there, child pornography, maybe something about, that a terrorist organization might use to commit acts of crime, those kinds of things. Unless it's something like that, internet service providers want you to go be able to get content. I mean, they are in the business to make money. So the fact that they're in the business to make money, they want to make sure that people can get to whatever content they want. It's not about politics. They don't care what your politics are. They don't care what the color of your skin is. They are perfectly fine. If you give them money, everybody pays them the same amount of money. And there's certain things that can make a difference there as far as what their costs are in certain areas. But as long as you pay the money, they are perfectly happy to let you go anywhere on the internet. That is, again, something that's legal content. According to the independent measurement, they talk about speed tests here, speeds have gone up. And a lot of this isn't, again, the only correlation here would be the fact that their costs haven't been impacted by net neutrality regulations. So they have a little bit more money maybe to be able to upgrade their infrastructure, those kinds of things. It's not that direct a relation or correlation. But I think the bigger thing is that nothing bad has happened. Net neutrality has not having net neutrality regulations in place hasn't caused problems. But he's claiming here that it's actually done the opposite. He says on top of that, in addition to speeds, better speeds, on top of that, consumers are benefiting from more choice than in 2018. Again, limited correlation there. He mentions the fact that you've got T-Mobile providing high-speed 5G service. You've got Starlink providing satellite service. So there's more competition that way. Net neutrality regulations really didn't have anything to do with competition. Again, all it could possibly do would make it a little bit easier for a new operator to get into the business because their costs, regulatory costs, were a little bit less. But it really didn't have anything to do with competition from that standpoint. In contrast, this is a very interesting point. I've made this point in the past, same point in the past. In contrast, between America's broadband consumers and their European counterparts, actually, I haven't made this one, sorry. During the COVID-19 pandemic is telling, Americans with internet access largely were able to rely on broadband networks to do video conferencing calls, stream in high def, and otherwise stay connected. And that's true. COVID hit this country, and I have made this point. COVID hit this country, and our internet service providers, for the most part, were able to handle that if they had a good broadband network. And I'm talking specifically about cable companies. Obviously, fiber companies had no problem. Where it was an issue, or maybe some people on some fixed wireless technologies that were not higher speeds, and certainly DSL technologies, that's where we noticed we had problems. And those are the unserved and the underserved areas. And obviously, they're going to have problems regardless of whether you've got a lot of this. Regardless of whether you got COVID-19, it just became more apparent during COVID-19, especially with kids and education and parents being at home and working, that kind of thing. So that's true. But he's saying here that we handle it much better in Europe, where in Europe they were telling people they probably needed to throttle connections because of the COVID pandemic. And he says here, this is the part that I've said in the past for sure. It says, now, to be fair, one prediction the critics made was accurate, sort of. Over the past 5 years, online consumers have indeed been blocked from posting or accessing politically disfavored content, but the blocking has not come from network operators that have been subject to net neutrality regulations, but from big tech companies, the very companies that for years lobbied for strict net neutrality regulations in a classic case of regulatory arbitrage. So that's absolutely true, because again, internet service providers, generally there's not a political component it's just a connection. Whereas on big content providers, this would be Google, Facebook, Twitter, where we have seen censorship has been on those platforms. And what's ironic and striking is that censorship, a lot of the things that were called disinformation, it was all done in the name of disinformation and not spreading that. But who is the arbitrator of that? And what's ironic is so much of the things that they claimed was disinformation at the time turned out to be true, right? So whether it was political kinds of things, as to whether there was Russian collusion, or whether the Hunter Biden laptop was true or not, or whether things about the virus, things about the vaccine. Lots of things that were put out there that was claimed to be disinformation actually turned out in the end to be true, demonstrably true. So here you have these big tech companies that were the ones that were actually blocking content, so that you thought you were seeing everything that was out there, and your content that was out there was being de-emphasized, where you were not seeing it. So that was really, if anybody needed to be under some kind of net neutrality kind of regulation, it was the big tech companies. And I said that back then, that those were the companies that had the power to actually, and the reason to be blocking content, not the internet service providers. Again, they tend to be politically neutral, or, honestly, if they're big internet service providers and big corporations, they tend to be more left-leaning anyway, because of just the fact that that's the way corporations are these days. So it's very interesting. He talks here about Twitter and how when Elon Musk bought it, it became apparent looking at some of the Twitter files and what was going on in the background, how there was this purposeful kind of censoring of content. Again, people thinking that it was for good reasons, because they thought, oh, well, this is disinformation. Obviously, this is disinformation. We've been told this is anti-science and this and that. And again, demonstrably false at the time. So the disinformation was actually coming from the other side. That's why free speech, we need to be free in our speech and have an exchange of ideas and let the idea that can be defended be the one that wins out. Don't be censoring speech. And that was what was going on. It says, let's see, that's pretty much it. Let's see what you've got here. 5 years from that seminal June day when net neutrality regulations were repealed, you probably didn't hear much about the issue anymore. Now, of course, we did hear about it, as I showed you, when the new person that's been nominated for the commission, can't remember her name, not Gonzalez, was it Gonzalez? Anyway, so that person was nominated, and we're hearing a lot about, oh, well, now this will help the FCC implement net neutrality. So those who are still on this net neutrality bandwagon, and those like this Free Press CEO who still is saying that this is somehow racially going to balance the scales, which there's no reason it would. People like that are still trying to keep this net neutrality thing in the air and make sure that it gets implemented. But for the most part, people have forgotten about it because they have no issues whatsoever with a net neutral internet because it is net neutral. They have no problem getting the content they want. And again, the only issue we've seen over the last few years has been, specific content being de-emphasized on social media platforms and search engines. So anyway, he says, you don't hear about that much anymore. I don't either. In fact, the closest it comes to is when someone stops me and asks whether I still have the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup mug that John Oliver helped make famous in 2017 during his fact-free rant about net neutrality. That's got something to do with, I think, and during maybe some of the things where they were talking about net neutrality, he had a mug, a Reese's cup on his mug, Reese's cup mug on his desk, and he was drinking from that. And there was a lot of back and forth and people complaining that about that. So he says, let's see, conversely, the overall over-the-top rhetoric has over time revealed itself to those of good faith as well, completely over the top. It was completely over the top. And I suppose those who are simply looking for a reason to be outraged now have moved on to the next thing. That's true, but again, there are still these people that want the rules in place, and they're still just as hyperbolic as they were 5 years ago about the end of the internet. They must not realize, maybe they must not realize that the internet is net neutral and nobody's having any trouble. In any event, if you've read to this point, congratulations, you managed to survive the end of the internet as we know it, and now can tell your story. So anyway, I like that. I thought that was a really well-written article. Again, there's some things that are debatable as to the impact of not having the regulations, how much of that on the positive side, but certainly nothing negative has happened as far as net neutrality, net neutrality regulations not being there in place. A lot of times you say net neutrality is not in place now. No, net neutrality is in place. There's just no regulations that would punish somebody if something net neutral didn't happen. But again, when the few things did happen in the past, it was addressed, didn't require rules, was not costly to broadband providers, all broadband providers that were playing by the rules. It was not costly to them. It did not increase the cost of others to get in the broadband business. It will help broadband deployment funds go further because people don't have to deal with net neutrality regulations. Again, it were rules looking for a problem, and there was no problem. If we ever get to a point where there's a clear problem, like I mentioned, maybe the prioritization or something like that, and that starts getting put in place, I think that would probably be taken care of without instituting regulations. Just the threat of instituting regulations would probably have people stop doing that if there doesn't seem to be anything right now a rule right now that could be used. But if there ever is something, they can implement a really well-defined rule that will take care of that situation, and not something based on an old telecom rule that has nothing to do with broadband. That's really what was implemented in the Obama administration, and they certainly shouldn't bring that back. And there's no real reason really to bring anything else back until we see that there was a problem. Why put onerous rules on people if there's not an issue? And that's sometimes, unfortunately, what government wants to do. Thanks for joining me for this somewhat political episode of Broadband Deployment News. I appreciate your hanging with me. If you did, if this was helpful or interesting, if you give me a like on the video, I'd appreciate it. If you are not subscribed to our channel, go ahead and click the subscribe button. Click the bell to be notified when I'm live. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.